Dobro jutro svima, zahvaljujem
Good
profesoru.
morning. Thank you, Professor Halilović, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It is really an honor that I can speak here, but also I have to mention some difficulties because speaking about the victims is always difficult, particularly if the victims are not part of your family or a collective. For all of us, Srebrenica victims are an obstacle in our progress to the future, a very important issue for the future of the Bosnian and Herzegovinian society. I often view this in this relation between space and experience. The space is full of traumatized experience and horizons of expectations, and in the Bosniak population this is something that contrasts. So this is a nearly sucked space full of screens and is intertwined with various types of expectations, hopes, and also the unforeseeable future. I will talk about victims in patriarchal terms, but patriotic terms, but I've changed this into political. So for no religion or worldview, it is not unimportant to have the image of a man which is set in as ideal, and that image is further transposed into the educational system and the public sphere. Since our society, which is tripartite in terms of having three different societies within a single one, these societies are the societies of unreconciled past and are very much under the influence of ethnic collectivism, and therefore the ethnic educational system is burdened with the political and ethnic anthropologies, as some authors call them, anthropologies from the right. The anthropology from the right has replaced anthropology of the revolutionary or the classless man of the previous system, the man of brotherhood and unity. In the new anthropology, the identity of a man, his morality, and the social and political role is being shaped by exclusivity and denial of the other, anyone who is ethnically different, and by denial of the victims and the dead and the victims of the genocide as well. A man is not his own project or an experiment, as we say in the educational moderna. We've lived a branch of communist Marxism here, and I can say that a man is not his own experiment and memory, and therefore the relationship to the past is this comprising part of each anthropology, in part as a responsibility for the past of one's own collective, and in the second, on the other hand, as co-suffering or an attempt to exit that space and face the suffering of the others. Srebrenica has become a topos where we have the development of two types of anthropology: the anthropology of the perpetrator of Srebrenica that creates oblivion and denial, and therefore Srebrenica acts as subversive memory, the one which is always hushed up. And on the other hand, we have the victims, where Srebrenica is becoming one of the key events in the narrative identity. And our identities are narrative, and therefore factography of science or history cannot cover them. And there we have a conflict of the two concepts. The concept of subversive memory, so the memory which is deferred and which to a certain extent becomes pathological oblivion, and on the other hand, Srebrenica is a founding event for an overall collective. And this memory is often hypertrophied and is becoming almost an excess as such. We have different aporias towards the relationship with the past, continuity of the identity, as well as making the difference between the individual narrative identity, which does not match the collective identity, because individuals remember differently than the collective, even though the individual is within the collective. On the other hand, the collective is determined, collective memory or the collective oblivion is determined by the collective institutions such as schools, the media, politics, and above all, religious and spiritual institutions, the church or the Islamic community in our case. And these communities are too dominant in terms of their role in our future. So this is a conflict of patriotic anthropologies, as I've titled my presentation. And I've titled it a bit that way because the Great Serbia project had its part, which is similar to the Nazi Germany, to clean one's own living space of all others. So in the concept of understanding the social life of individual ethnic groups, in this case Serbs, they needed to clean their Lebensraum of others. And quoting certain Serb historians in this regard, in this approach of the Great Serbia ideology of the so-called movable state, the para-state, in the approach in the creation, which was often based on the language basis or the clean grade, so to say, has created this impossibility to process one's own subversive memory. Even though this might seem to the victims that the main protagonists of perpetrators do not know what had happened, they know the facts. So this memory of the perpetrators is transformed into pathological or defect memory, and in certain way it continues. And this is a problem with the Dayton. It still supports itself as if the subversive memory is the only sensible one. And with its structures that the Dayton confirms and keeps, the physical violence is gone, but the structures of violence are still ongoing. So we are now entering something that the authors call violence as culture. We are getting reconciled with death. And the pathological memory has its concept, damnatium memoriae, destroy every trace of the other, or ignore the other. As Robert Šarcević says, evaporate the other so that the other disappears. We do not have any recollection of the other anymore. And the peak of such an anthropological project is, and the damnatio memoriae, is the setting of the important symbols, our own symbols instead of the symbols of others. And this is happening in this country. As I'm talking here about the space, the homeland, the conquering of the homeland as my only space, so to say. Theologically speaking, this is something that we can find in the Bible. God will take his people to the promised land, and then the Israelis hoped for a clean land, free of the others, and that there is no such land, and there will never be such land. There is no land that is free of diversity. And this is why I am emphasizing here the patriotic, this homeland anthropology. On the other hand, the patriotic anthropology of victims is often just a negative reflex of what the subversive oblivion is with the perpetrator. And this is why the generations of victims think about perpetrators more than they think of the actual victims. And this is something where we also see the perverse, lucrative political approach to this, and we need to stop with this. Even though I'm not a Bosniak, I have to say that, because the hypertrophic memory and the manipulation of numbers without a face, we know, we've learned this from the Second World War, we still haven't processed that, because this leaves the victims in the auto-victimological paradigm, where the person is constantly seeing his own identity, either individual as a collective, as identity of the victim without the dignity, and is being fascinated by the evil of the perpetrator and the wrongdoer, instead of working on a better future with a clarity about what had happened. How am I with the timing? Okay, I'm ending. I've just stated a few of my theses, and just briefly I tackle a few more things. You know that Srebrenica is the birthplace of Bosnian Franciscans. This is where we got our name. And what remains? Just the name and some of the remnants. And if I can say anything from the experience of this community and all the ethnic communities and religious communities here, I think that we really should learn that history is something which is unrepairable in many segments. This is what we need to learn, and it is also unforeseeable. And as one author says, we should not make the past future. What I also find important is, when it comes to Srebrenica, we should always make clear two issues and insist on them, and requests from the structures of Republika Srpska and the Republic of Serbia, particularly requests from Belgrade as the epicenter of evil of the Great Serbia Wars. We need to always stress the issue and ask the question, can the regimes and the institutions, and we've heard the presentations yesterday about this, can the regimes and institutions meet and process and accept their subversive memory and clean their memory and repent and compensate for justice? This is just a question we need to keep asking. The other question and issue which is important for the victims, and that can also be applied to other places of suffering in the world, and this question is very important, we see that through history, how to avoid victims becoming wrongdoers. This is something that we see in various places. We see reasons being found, justifications being found for new war. And this is why we need to face the victims with this question. Will Srebrenica, for the victims, become a reason for a new war in different circumstances, and maybe not in our time? I would plea here for a new anthropology. As our space and our communities are saturated with faith, I would plea for a man of a small faith accepting his own finity, meaning that the founding religious institutions that are metaphysical umbrellas and the strongest institutions, which will be the last to be critical of their own wrong, they are the one who need to advocate for the dignity of men, for humility. And this is how dignity to people is being restored. So I plea for an anthropology of a man of small faith. And also I would plea for a man of big betrayal. We know that in our peoples, in the entities and in the collectives, all those who are friendly with others are being judged. But we always like to see, because we don't like, looking at Srđan Aleksić and some other examples. We have many of those examples. For example, we praise in Nazism the cardinal, or some philosophers like Jaspers, or theologians like Barth, or Bonhoeffer, who was also pastor in one of the Hitler's camps. So, translated into the secular civic language, we need people of civic courage, ready to betray. Those who will not listen to what the collective opinion imposes on them. And by that, we will have a transition from one's own ethnia and one's own confession, and we will have the path being developed to a new culture of remembrance, a new culture of understanding of people, to a new culture of accepting the sufferings of others, and a new culture of avoiding stereotypes about others. Thank you very much.